As a real estate agent, I bet you've heard of trusts, but do you know how to sell a property held by one? Today, we'll cover everything you need to know to sell property held by trusts. A common entity that we see hold property is what's called a trust. So a trust can actually own property just like a human can, or any other entity like an LLC. So the first question we should ask is, what is a trust? So a trust is an entity that's created between two different parties. They have an arrangement. There's a fiduciary. We usually call this person a trustee here in the state of Michigan. This fiduciary is going to hold on to assets on behalf of the beneficiary named in the trust. That beneficiary is the person who's going to benefit from the trust. So we know what a trust is, but how do I know if this property is held in a trust? Well, it's very simple. We're going to look at that deed and we're going to see who the grantee is listed on the deed. The grantee would tell us that the property is held by the trust. So instead of the deed being from Bob to Sally, it's going to be from Bob to Sally as the trustee of Sally's trust. So another question that we want to ask ourselves, why are we putting this property in a trust? Why do we want to have a trust hold the property? So usually when our clients are using a trust and they're deeding the property into the trust, this is a method of estate planning. So by creating this trust and deeding the property into the trust, now you have an entity holding title. And so that property becomes trust property instead of property owned by that human. Once the property is deeded into the trust, that property is managed by the trustee for the benefit of the beneficiaries, according to how the rules created in the actual trust documents tell us. Otherwise, if an individual owns property at the time of their death, that property would be part of their estate. That means they would have to open up a probate estate, go through probate proceedings to confirm and determine who can then deed the property. If instead an individual puts that property into a trust, when they pass away, that ownership doesn't change. Whomever the current trustee is simply refers to the trust documents, and then they are able to manage the property according to the rules set out in the trust. No need to go to probate court or do any of those items. So how do we determine how trusts are managed, created, etc.? So Michigan Trust Code is actually going to tell us exactly what we need to do, how trusts are created, what we can rely on, what documentation it is that we need. So remember, one of our important questions we need to look for an answer to is, how do I know who can sign on behalf of a trust? And Michigan Trust Code tells us that we can rely on that trust document itself, but man, that trust document could be 150 pages. It could have social security numbers in it. It could have some very personal, private details. And people may not want to hand that special binder over to somebody they don't know just to determine who has the right to sign on behalf of that entity. That trust may also change. It might be old, outdated, could be 20, 25 years old. So what is it that we can use to confirm today who our signer should be? Well, Michigan compiled laws tell us that we can rely on a certificate of trust. So that certificate of trust is what is going to tell us who can sign, and it's going to give us some really important information about that trust. Michigan compiled laws, also known as MCLs, 700.7913, it sets out exactly what needs to be contained in that certificate of trust. Our certificate of trust can't just be a document that says, Caitlin's trust document, Caitlin can sign. That's not enough. That's not what we need. We've got to follow the compiled laws in the state of Michigan, and we have to include all the important information. We've got to follow their rules. So first and foremost, it's going to tell us who the current trustee is. It's going to tell us who the correct signer is. It's going to include the name and the date of the trust, names and addresses of all the trustees, again, including the current trustee. It's going to tell us the powers that trustee has. Can they sell property? Can they not sell property? It's also going to list whether or not the trust is revocable or irrevocable. If you have multiple trustees, let's say you have brothers and sisters acting as trustees, that certificate of trust will tell us if they both have to sign or if only one of them has to sign. And then we also want to remember that usually when we're dealing with real estate, we want to record these documents. So that certificate of trust likely has to be in recordable format. We want to make sure that we can record it. The next big question is, how do I get a certificate of trust? Well, we have a lot of options. Our current trustee can always create that document. They can sign it. And a really common thing to do as well is to go back to the attorney who created that trust. And that attorney likely has one already created or can create one for our clients very quickly. So our next big question is, how do I get my property in a trust? What does this look like? How do we get here? So first, it usually starts with an idea. Somebody says, hey, I would like to put my trust or my property in my trust, either for estate planning purposes or otherwise. And it usually also starts with an attorney. In the state of Michigan, trusts can get a little bit complicated. A lot of people like an attorney to prepare that trust for them, ask a lot of questions, and then they'll prepare that document. And those trusts range from a couple pages long to hundreds of pages long. And that settlor, the person who is the one creating the trust, is going to write it down. It's going to get signed. Now, the next step is really important. The trust has to get funded. That means we actually have to deed property into the trust. If I, as Caitlin, own property, and I also have a trust, it doesn't mean my trust is being used to hold that property. My property is not inherently in the trust. I have to actually deed the property into the trust. We have to fund it. Now, if I don't own the property yet, and I want to just purchase it in the trust, I absolutely can do that. It can go straight from my seller right into my trust. There can be some complexities when we get lenders involved because lenders may not want to loan money to a trust per se. Either way, the property has to be deeded into the trust. Once the property is in the trust, remember, it's the trustee who can act on behalf of the trust. So that purchase agreement deed, etc., that trustee is going to be the person who's signing those documents. Now, we get back to our initial question, who the heck is our trustee? Who can sign on behalf of the trust? What do I need for my closing? Remember, that's where we're going to go back to our certificate of trust. We're going to look at our certificate of trust and we're going to be able to see who our trustee is. And Michigan compiled laws tell us that we can rely on that certificate of trust to provide us with that information. So my property is held in a trust and we want to close this property. My seller wants to sell their property. We know it's held by a trust. What am I going to need to do? Number one, remember, I might need that certificate of trust and it's probably going to need to be up to date. It depends on the scenario. We might need one that's executed within the last 6 months, last 12 months. But we always know we're going to need that certificate of trust most likely. And another important thing to remember is that in Michigan, there's no registry for trusts. We can't look up and see who the signer is or even who, quote unquote, owns or created any specific trust. So that documentation, that certificate of trust, that trust document itself is very, very, very important. There's really not a lot of replacements for that. So as I'm preparing for closing, I know I need to know who's signing. I probably need my certificate of trust, but I'm also going to review my purchase agreement. I'm going to make sure that when I'm initially talking with my client, we know all of our terms in the purchase agreement that may become an issue for our trustee. The first one we want to look at is our deed. So If we're dealing with a trust, the person who's signing on behalf of that trust, the trustee, may not actually have any knowledge of the property. They may not be comfortable giving a warranty deed. They may want to give a different type of deed, and they may not want to sign a warranty deed. We want to have that conversation on the front end when we are signing our purchase agreement. Now, the next thing we want to think about is the title insurance. Are we offering or agreeing to provide title insurance with or without standard exceptions? If we need to provide title insurance without standard exceptions, there's going to be additional affidavits and documents that have to be signed by the seller, who, remember, is signed on behalf of a trustee. And again, we want to make sure that our trustee is comfortable answering a lot of these questions that are very property specific. So if we know that our current trustee, who's signing all the documents, doesn't have an intimate knowledge of the property, we want to make sure that we are offering to provide the correct type of policy based on our client's comfort level. Now, the next thing we're going to need is, what is our tax ID number for the trust? When our seller goes to sign that 1099-S, we have that trustee signing that document. We want to make sure that they're prepared. They know what the tax ID number, either for the trust is that they're going to use, or if they're going to use their own Social Security number. We want to make sure that they're prepared to have the right number available at the time of closing. And another big thing we want to make sure that our client is prepared for is, at the closing, if that trust is getting proceeds because they're selling the property, we need to make sure that they've got a bank account in the name of the trust, right? Because that proceeds check is going to be made out to the trust, or those funds are going to be wired to the trust. We want to make sure that they have a bank account set up in the name of the trust. And then another thing we want to think about, and really the last item we want to just make sure is on our radar. We know an attorney is usually involved with a trust. We've maybe used them to prepare the certificate of trust. They may have been involved in the process. We want to know on the front end if that attorney needs to do a document review. We want to make sure that we're setting the appropriate expectations. Do we need some extra time to review those documents? Do we want to try to get documents over to that attorney as early as possible, just to make sure that we don't have to delay closing for that? Whew, that was a lot. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. I hope you learned some really valuable information today. If you've got any questions about your scenario or general questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, or give me a call or email directly, and I'm happy to help. If you're ready to work with us, click the link below to start your order. Thanks for hanging out today. We'll see you soon.